She found her husband's secret hut after his death, but she didn't know that beneath the floor lay a truth that would change destinies. Look what she saw inside. Subscribe, and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Marla Hayden had never known her house to be this quiet. In the weeks since Garrett's funeral, the silence had taken on a weight of its own, filling every corner and sinking into the walls. She moved through the rooms as though they were still inhabited by him, as though the air itself remembered the sound of his boots on the floor or the soft clearing of his throat in the mornings. The curtains remained partly drawn, and what little winter light filtered into the living room cast pale, cold rectangles across the floorboards. Outside, the snow on the porch was undisturbed, except for the tracks of a single mail carrier who had stopped coming as often, noticing no one hurried anymore to the door. Even the heater seemed to hum with a quieter, more restrained vibration, as if reluctant to break the stillness. Marla tried not to think. When she allowed thoughts to run freely, they led her not to memories of warmth or companionship, but to the hollow ache of an abruptly broken path. So instead she moved her hands, compelled them to work, to pick up, wipe, fold, reposition objects that had not asked to be moved. She stacked old magazines, polished the already clean table, opened and closed drawers without taking anything from them. It was not productivity. It was a battle against inertia. But even in this self-imposed motion, she found herself slowing down at certain objects. Garrett's coat still hanging by the door, stiff with the dried scent of outdoors. The pair of boots he had worn on their last hike, the laces tucked inside as he always left them. Or the cup he had used the morning before the heart attack took him, still clean, but placed on the same shelf out of habit rather than reason. Her son, Jonas, watched her from time to time, uncertain and quietly worried, though he rarely spoke about it. At 7, he understood the concept of death with the innocent, almost detached logic of a child, but he did not understand grief. What he saw was his mother drifting, her steps slower, her gaze distant, her hands busy but never creating or accomplishing anything. He tried to help her sometimes, picking up his toys without being asked, placing his small gloves by the heater so they would be warm when they went outside. But nothing he did seemed to make her look less fragile, and that frightened him in ways he could not articulate. Late one afternoon, after hours of drifting through memories she was not ready to face, Marla decided to force herself into a task that seemed concrete enough: organizing the boxes in the attic. It was a place she had avoided since Garrett died. He had kept many of his old things up there: camping gear, seasonal decorations, tools he rarely used but refused to throw away. She climbed the narrow staircase with the sense of stepping into untouched time, each creak under her boots reminding her how often Garrett had made this climb alone. The attic smelled faintly of cedar and dust, and the weak winter light through the small window caught dust motes drifting like slow-moving snowflakes. The boxes were stacked mostly neatly, though some had sagged under their own age. Marla knelt beside one of the older ones and opened it. Inside were sweaters folded so carefully they still held the shape of Garrett's hands, an old camera with a scratched lens, a compass with a cracked face, and at the bottom, wrapped in worn flannel, a small leather-bound book. She recognized it instantly: Garrett's old hiking Bible. He had carried it with him through every long trip, every hunting season, every journey into the wilderness. She had often teased him that he read it more for the comfort of its familiar pages than for the words printed on them. She held it with the reverence one might give an heirloom, though she had never thought of it that way before. When she opened it, a folded sheet slipped out and floated lightly onto the wooden floor like a feather. At first she thought it was a receipt, or an old note he had forgotten to remove, but when she picked it up, she realized it was a map. The paper was yellowed, edges softening into fray, but the pencil lines were crisp enough to reveal careful intention. A trail traced across the northern plateau, through stretches of terrain that she recognized only vaguely from distant trips. It led toward the Monte Cliff region, a rugged and seldom visited canyon too harsh to attract casual hikers in winter. Her breath caught when she read the note near the map's end, point small, careful handwriting, unmistakably Garrett's. Haven. A place for heavy truths. Forgive me. She held the map for a long moment without breathing, the attic growing colder as the winter light dimmed further outside. A place he had never spoken of, a place he had marked with a word that suggested finality, confession, weight, heavy truths. Forgive me. She wondered how many times he had come here alone, how many winters he had stood in silent contemplation of something too painful to carry back home. Her heart tightened, not with anger, not yet, but with the dawning dread of neglected revelations. That night, she could not sleep. She lay awake, listening to the wind press against the siding, thinking of the map unfolding like a path she had ignored her entire marriage. Thoughts came in unbidden waves, Garrett leaving early in the mornings for clearing his head walks, the tiredness behind his eyes, on nights when he claimed work had drained him, the subtle but consistent avoidance when she asked about his past before they met. She had dismissed these gaps as harmless. Everyone had chapters of their life they tucked away, but this map made her suspect that his hidden chapters had held more than simple privacy. They had held something unfinished, unresolved, perhaps even tormenting. By dawn, she had made her decision. The cold clarity of early morning sharpened her resolve. She would go to the place Garrett had marked, not out of suspicion, but out of necessity. She needed to know the truth he had carried in silence. She needed to understand the man she had loved for nearly 2 decades. She needed to see what he had been unable to show her. Jonas found her in the kitchen packing a rucksack. Thermos, sandwiches, extra gloves, 2 thermal blankets, a first aid kit, and the map carefully placed in a waterproof sleeve. He asked where they were going, and she told him it was a small winter adventure. She did not want him burdened by the purpose of the trip, though he watched her with an expression that told her he sensed something unusual. She packed more carefully for him than for herself, an extra pair of socks, his small insulated boots, a wool hat that covered his ears, and a scarf she wrapped twice to ensure warmth. They stepped outside just before sunrise. The snow was deep, undisturbed, glittering softly in the early light. The air bit her cheeks immediately, but she welcomed the sting. It meant she was alive, grounded, moving. Jonas walked beside her, occasionally dragging his glove through the snow, collecting handfuls to toss toward the trees. At first, the trail seemed manageable, a soft incline leading away from their home and toward the open plateau. Marla studied the map, tracing each mark with her eyes, aligning landmarks with the faint shapes of distant ridges. As they ascended, the snow grew deeper, rising past their ankles, then to Jonas's calves. He trudged, but did not complain, and she admired his resilience. The higher they climbed, the sharper the wind became, swirling loose snow in thin spirals that danced across the ground. The plateau stretched farther than she remembered, an open expanse of white, broken only by patches of bare rock and scattered evergreen trees hunched under the weight of snow. The sky was pale and cloud-thick, hinting at more weather to come. Hours passed with steady progress. Jonas began to tire, and Marla strapped his small pack onto her own, making the load heavier, but more manageable for him. They paused occasionally for water and warmth, though the cold seeped through clothing quickly. She checked the map repeatedly, tracing the penciled route and comparing it to the terrain around them. She began to notice something she had missed at first, small, deliberate cairn stacks of stones marking turns or confirming direction. Garrett must have placed them carefully, perhaps years ago, trusting they would remain through seasons of snow and wind. As the afternoon wore on, the wind picked up in force, pushing against them with icy gusts. The visibility shrank slightly, and Marla's worry grew. She knew that once the weather truly turned, the plateau could become disorienting and dangerous. She pushed them forward toward the canyon, urging Jonas to stay close. His cheeks were flushed with cold, but he kept moving, looking up at her occasionally with a mixture of trust and fatigue. By the time they reached the rim of the canyon, the snow had thickened, swirling heavily in the air. The world felt smaller, enclosed by white and wind. The canyon's entrance loomed ahead, a narrow gap between two towering rock walls, darkened by shadow. The snow on the canyon floor lay in a smooth, undisturbed layer, as though untouched for months. The air here seemed even colder, carrying a deep silence, broken only by the distant echo of wind passing through stone. A sense of unease tugged at her, but so did a determination deeper than fear. She guided Jonas into the canyon, where the wind lessened slightly, replaced by an eerie stillness. Their footsteps left crisp imprints behind them. They followed the narrow passage until the canyon widened into a concealed hollow, and there, as though wading through decades, stood a small wooden cabin built against the stone wall. The roof was red, weather-beaten, but intact. Snow had piled up against one side, but the structure looked surprisingly sturdy. The windows were frosted from the inside, catching faint glimmers of the late afternoon light. The cabin seemed untouched by time, yet filled with an aura of patient endurance. Marla stopped for a moment, heart pounding not from exhaustion, but from the sudden, overwhelming sense that she was standing on the threshold of something Garrett had never wanted her to see while he lived. Jonas clung to her sleeve, looking up at the cabin with quiet curiosity. She moved toward the door, her boots crunching through deep snow, feeling the gravity of the moment. She lifted her hand to the handle, coated with frost, and paused, aware that whatever she found inside would change everything she thought she knew about her husband. Then she pushed. The door resisted, frozen by layers of ice, and she struck it with the handle of her hiking pole until it cracked free. A rush of cold, stale air greeted them, like a breath held too long. They stepped inside, and the cabin swallowed their presence with the stillness of a sealed vault. The cold inside the cabin was deeper and quieter than the cold outside, as if the wooden walls had absorbed years of winter and learned to keep it close. Marla stood just inside the threshold, taking in the stillness that pressed against her ears. Her breath made faint clouds in the dim air, drifting upward and dissolving into the shadows. Jonas moved closer to her, his gloved hand tightening around her coat sleeve, instinctively sensing that this place was different from any other he had known. It wasn't just a cabin built into stone. It felt like a sealed chamber of someone's secluded life, a life carefully hidden, a life deliberately unshared. She stepped forward cautiously, her boots tapping lightly against the wooden floor, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. The room was small, perhaps 10 feet wide, with the stone wall forming the backside and the cabin walls enclosing the rest. A small metal stove stood in one corner, dark and cold, with a stack of old firewood beside it. A single bed, neatly made long ago and now coated with a thin layer of dust, sat against the far wall. A table, sturdy and plain, stood in the center, with a single wooden chair pulled slightly back, as if someone had once risen from it and simply never returned. But the detail that seized her attention immediately, the one that made her heartbeat quicken and her breath catch, was the entire right wall, lined from floor to ceiling with shelves. And on those shelves stood dozens upon dozens of glass jars, each meticulously arranged, each carefully sealed with red wax, each labeled with a year. The oldest jar was marked 1983. The newest, standing upright in the corner, with its wax seal still bright and smooth, bore the year they had just left behind. Marla felt a sudden shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. She stepped closer, afraid to disturb anything, yet unable to stop herself from looking. Jonas stayed back, wandering toward the bed and touching the blanket with tentative fingers, unaware of the significance of what she was seeing. She reached for a jar from a middle shelf, her fingers gliding over the wax, then paused. The jar felt heavier than it should have, packed with folded papers so tightly they filled every inch of space. She looked for a place to sit, confusingly aware that she was entering a private world, not meant to be found in this way. She chose the table, clearing a small patch of dust with the back of her glove. Jonas climbed onto the bed, curling up with his knees pulled close, his eyes on her, but without asking questions. She broke the wax seal gently, feeling it crack and crumble in small pieces onto the wood. Inside, she pulled out a bundle of papers, each folded precisely, edges smoothed, handwriting so unmistakably Garrett's that her vision blurred for a moment. She unfolded the top sheet, and the words came into focus slowly, as though appearing through fog. The handwriting was steady, clean, deliberate. If I am writing this, it is because silence has become heavier than memory. She read further, feeling as if each sentence peeled back a layer of the man she thought she knew. He described a version of his youth she had never heard, one filled with fear disguised as bravado, impulsive decisions shaped by loneliness, and the haunting guilt of leaving people behind when circumstances demanded impossible choices. He described his enlistment, not as a noble calling, but as a desperate attempt to prove something to himself. His recollection of the overseas conflict was not filled with valor, but with doubt and mistakes. He wrote of a woman named Nell, someone he had once cared for deeply. And then, as her hands tightened around the papers, she read the part that made her stomach clench. Nell had been pregnant. Garrett had left before the child was born. Nell had died during childbirth, and the child, a baby boy, had survived. Marla felt the weight of the cabin shift around her, the silence deepening into something more suffocating. The noise of the wind outside seemed to retreat further, as if the world itself paused. Jonas watched her from the bed, sensing a change, but not understanding it. She folded the papers back into the jar, her fingers trembling slightly, and stared ahead into the dimness of the cabin, as if trying to reshape her understanding of Garrett, with the new information now rewriting years of memory. She reached for another jar, then another. Each revealed more pieces of a life lived in parallel with the one he shared with her. These jars were not diaries, they were confessions, yearly attempts to unload burdens he could not bear aloud. He wrote about searching for the child, about trying to reach the family that had rejected him, about traveling to far places only to find closed doors. He wrote about the guilt that consumed him, the shame that grew each year, and the grief for a child he had never held but always thought about. Marla read until her eyes ached, the cold clinging to her bones, despite the thick layers of clothing. She felt as though she were descending deeper into Garrett's mind, each revelation both illuminating and wounding. She saw the years of fear hiding behind his gentle smile, the quiet evenings when he seemed lost in thought, the moments he had paused in mid-sentence, as though approaching words he could not bring himself to say. She felt angry, then sorrowful, then simply stunned, caught in the realization that the man she had loved had been divided between two worlds, one shared with her and one buried here, within these jars, in a place she had never known existed. The storm outside intensified, the wind whistling through cracks in the cabin walls with a rising, mournful sound. Snow lashed the windows, and the light outside dimmed to the color of polished steel. Marla lit a small lantern she found on a shelf, giving the room a warm, flickering glow, though it only illuminated how much remained unread. Jonas grew tired and lay down on the bed, the blanket pulled over him. The warmth from the lantern was not enough for true comfort, but he drifted toward sleep, lulled by the steady rhythm of his mother turning pages. Marla moved to another section of the shelves and found a small wooden box beneath a row of jars. Inside the box were letters, tied neatly with a frayed cord. She lifted them, and her breath stopped when she saw the words written on the top envelope. For my boy, Jonas, when he becomes a man. She sat down slowly, the lantern's flame trembling as she placed the letters on the table. The dates on them preceded Jonas's birth by several years. She opened the first letter, hands shaking slightly, and read words that revealed a tenderness she had known but never seen so plainly expressed. Garrett wrote to the son he did not yet have, apologizing for the father he had once been, promising to be better, and admitting that he feared repeating his past mistakes. He wrote about love-raw, pleading, hopeful, and about dreams of building a family unshadowed by regret. Marla pressed her palm against her forehead, tears welling despite her effort to hold them back, the revelations tangled inside her, forming knots of grief, compassion, betrayal, and empathy. She felt betrayed for not being told, but at the same time, she could not deny the agony Garrett must have carried. These were not the writings of a man who had forgotten his past, but of one who lived with it like an unhealed wound. The storm raged outside with relentless force, and the cabin shuddered under the weight of the wind. Marla knew they would not leave tonight. The snow was too deep, the visibility too poor. She rose and checked the stove again, wondering whether it was safe to start a fire. The chimney looked unobstructed, and the wood felt dry. She stacked several logs carefully, lit a small fire, and soon warmth began to spread through the room, pushing back the harshest of the cold. Jonas stirred and sat up, rubbing his eyes. Marla helped him off the bed, wrapped him in a blanket, and offered him a warm drink from their thermos. He drank slowly, still sleepy but comforted by the glow of the fire. He sat near her, watching the flames dance, unaware that the world had shifted beneath them both. As night fell, Marla returned to the jars, driven not by curiosity, but by the need to understand fully. She read about Garrett's attempts to reach the family who had raised his first son, about their refusal to allow contact, about the letters returned unopened. She read about the years where Garrett nearly gave up searching, then found renewed resolve. She read about the guilt that ate at him, guilt for leaving Nell, guilt for failing his son, guilt for hiding another life from the woman he loved. Every revelation felt like stepping deeper into a cavern of sorrow and confession. And yet, unexpectedly, she also felt the first flicker of understanding. Garrett had not been silent out of arrogance or indifference. He had been silent because he feared losing what he had built with her. He had feared exposing her to the burden he had carried for decades. She could see now why he had never found the courage to speak, because speaking would have made everything real, tangible, and irreversible. She closed the letters carefully and placed them back in the box. The fire crackled behind her, casting long shadows across the room. Jonas had fallen asleep again near the warmth, curled beneath the blanket like a small creature finding safety in the only haven available. Marla stared at the jars one more time, trying to absorb the enormity of what she had discovered. Her heart ached with heaviness, with questions she could not yet form, and with a strange, quiet determination that surprised her. The truth was devastating, but it was also a key to the final, hidden part of Garrett's life, the part she now realized she needed to confront. The storm outside howled through the canyon, its voice echoing through the wood and stone, but inside the cabin, the fire burned steadily, holding the dark at bay. Marla knew she would not sleep tonight. There was more to uncover, and she sensed instinctively that somewhere within this room lay the final piece of Garrett's truth, the one he had never dared to share. She listened to the wind, to the crackle of the fire, to Jonas's soft breathing, and she remained there, suspended in the fragile space between the man she remembered and the man she was only now discovering. The storm weakened sometime before dawn, though Marla only realized it when the howling wind finally faded into a distant moan along the canyon walls. She had not slept. Her eyes ached from reading, and her mind throbbed under the weight of everything she had learned. The fire in the small stove had burned low, with only a faint orange glow pulsing from the embers. Jonas lay curled near it, wrapped in 2 blankets, his breath soft and steady, unaware of the night his mother had lived through awake, unraveling the last unknown threads of Garrett's life. As the cabin grew quieter, the silence sharpened every thought inside her, and she could no longer pretend that the jars and letters were the only things Garrett had hidden. The cabin was too carefully arranged, too organized. The secrets he had written were too thorough to end with what she had already read. There was always something more with Garrett. Something untold, something unsaid, something he intended to take with him to the grave, but had not fully managed to hide. Marla rose from the chair, stretching her stiff limbs. She moved slowly across the cabin, studying the floor, the corners, the shelves, her breath forming small clouds that drifted upward. The floorboards creaked softly under her weight, old wood worn by decades of Montana winters. She walked back toward the stove, remembering the way the first cabin she had ever seen as a girl had possessed a loose board near the hearth. It had been her uncle's fishing shack by the lake, a place where every child in the family had tried to discover hidden treasure beneath the floor. There had been nothing then, not even a lost coin, but the memory returned with sudden clarity now as she stared at the darker patch of wood near the stove where snowmelt had dried unevenly. She knelt, her fingers brushing along the seams of the boards, tracing them lightly until one edge gave slightly beneath her touch. The board felt looser than the others, as though someone had lifted it before. Her pulse quickened. She pressed harder, easing her fingers beneath the edge, pulling upward. It resisted at first, then rose slowly with a groaning creak. Dust billowed up, glimmering faintly in the dim lantern light. Beneath the board lay a small recess carved into the earth, a narrow cavity that held a single metal box. Unlike the first box she had opened, this one was heavier, larger, and clearly locked. A keyhole glinted at the front. Marla stared at it for a long moment, her breath caught somewhere between fear and inevitability. Whatever lay inside was not meant for casual discovery. Garrett had hidden it beneath the floor itself, not on a shelf, not in plain sight, but buried like something dangerous or precious, or both. She glanced around the small cabin, her gaze landing on the shelf where the unopened letters still lay. She scanned the walls until her eyes found a nail near the cot, where a small key dangled from a thin piece of twine. She stood slowly, every movement deliberate, and walked to it, lifting it into her palm. It was cold and old, but it fit the shape she had seen on the box. Jonas stirred in his sleep, shifting slightly under the blankets. She watched him for a moment, feeling a pang of guilt for the world she was pulling him into, a world crafted from secrets he was too young to understand. But she knew that whatever lay inside that box was not only Garrett's past, Some part of it might shape Jonas's future, too. She returned to the open floorboard and knelt again. Her fingers were steady now as she inserted the key, turned it, and heard the lock click open with a sound that echoed through the quiet room. She lifted the lid slowly, half bracing herself for something terrible. Inside, she found photographs, hundreds of them, tied in small bundles, each labeled with careful dates. She saw Nell's face again, younger than in the earlier photograph, smiling shyly beside Garrett on what looked like a dusty foreign street. She saw a man holding a newborn child. Garrett, unmistakably, though much younger, his expression fragile and terrified, a moment Marla had never been told existed. She saw images of places she did not recognize. Rivers, markets, sunlit alleys, with scrawled notes on the backs in Garrett's handwriting, small memories he had kept for no one but himself. Beneath the photographs were documents, yellowed folders, letters written in languages she did not immediately recognize, official seals pressed into paper. She pulled out one folder and opened it, revealing a series of reports Garrett had filed during his years overseas. They contained names, maps, and accounts of moments he had never mentioned in his stories. She read enough to understand that Garrett's service had been far more complicated than simple deployment. And then, at the bottom of the box, she found a sealed envelope with her name written on the front. Her breath caught. She reached for the envelope with trembling fingers and unsealed it, unfolding the letter inside. The handwriting was Garrett's. The lines were uneven, as though written by a man whose hand had begun to betray him with age. My Marla, if you ever find this place, then you already know more than I ever had the courage to tell you. This letter is not a confession like the others. It is something I wanted you to read, only if fate led you here. There is one truth I have not written in the jars, one truth I never knew how to face. Marla's heartbeat quickened as she read. Nell's child, the boy who lived, grew up under another name. For years I searched for him without success. But 2 winters before Jonas was born, I found him. She froze. The lantern flickered. The air felt suddenly brittle. He was living in Washington State, raising a family of his own. I wrote to him. I tried to explain. He refused to meet. He wanted nothing to do with me. I respected his choice. She felt her throat tighten as she read the next lines. But I did meet one of his children, a girl, barely out of her teenage years. She came to see me. She asked for the truth. I told her everything. She forgave me in a way her father could not. Her name was Andrea. Marla stared at the name, unsure why it struck her so deeply. She visited me twice more that year. She wanted to know the stories her grandfather had never told. I saw in her the forgiveness I had never earned. But on her last visit, she told me something that shook me to the core. Marla forced herself to continue. She said that her father, my son, had died in an accident just months earlier. I had not known. She came to tell me because she thought I deserved the truth, even if I hadn't been there for him. Marla's pulse hammered in her ears. I never wrote about this in the jars, because the grief felt too fresh, too sharp. I had lost a child I had never held, and I had found a granddaughter I barely knew. The next line was written more shakily. And Marla, she is still out there. Andrea, the last link to the child I lost. If you ever feel strong enough, I hope you will find her. Not for me, but for Jonas. She is part of him, too. Marla lowered the letter, letting her gaze drift to the walls of the cabin. Everywhere she looked, she saw pieces of Garrett's life, his regrets, his hidden hopes, his unspoken fears. And now she knew that his hidden history extended farther than she had imagined. There was another living thread out there, somewhere, carrying his blood, carrying his story. and Garrett had wanted their son to know her. The weight of it all pressed down on Marla until she felt breathless. She closed the metal box gently, placed the letter beside her heart, and lowered the floorboard over the cavity again. Jonas still slept lightly by the fire, warmed by its heat, unaware of how close his life had come to being shaped by secrets he had never known. The lantern dimmed further, its flame thinning. Marla stood, walked to the stove, and added more wood, watching the fire swell back to life. Outside, the morning light began to creep across the canyon, pale and muted, behind the lingering storm clouds. She sat beside Jonas, holding him close as she watched the flames dance. She had come to the mountain searching only for answers. Simple ones, she had believed. But what she had found went deeper than she had expected. The canyon, the cabin, the jars. They had forced her to confront a truth Garrett had buried, not out of malice, but out of fear. He had feared what she would think of him. He had feared losing the life they had built. Now she understood that the only thing left to fear was doing nothing with the truth she had found. The storm clouds finally receded completely, revealing a clear, cold sky. Snow lay deep outside, nearly up to her knees, she knew, but it was no longer a barrier. It felt instead like a clean sheet spread over the world, a blank page waiting to be written on. She looked down at Jonas, sleeping peacefully, soft curls falling over his forehead. His face still held the innocence of childhood, but behind it lay a lineage he did not know yet. A lineage she had a responsibility to reveal when the time was right. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew now what direction the next step pointed in. Down the mountain. Back home. And then, when her strength allowed it, toward Andrea. The morning light that filtered into the cabin was muted and pale, softened by the thick snow that coated the canyon like a white shroud. Marla stood by the window for a long time, watching the fresh drifts settle into stillness, as if the world had paused to let her decide what came next. Jonas was awake now, half drowsy and rubbing his eyes as he stretched beneath the blankets. The fire in the stove had dwindled to a soft glow, but the room held enough warmth to ward off the harshest cold. She knew they had to leave the cabin soon. The storm had ended, but the weather would not stay mild for long, not in a place like this. Yet she lingered, her hands pressed lightly to the rough wooden sill, the weight of the discovery still heavy in her chest. Last night had changed everything. It had cracked open a chapter of Garrett's life she had never imagined existed. And now, standing in the quiet aftermath, she felt as though she were no longer just the woman Garrett had left behind. She was the keeper of his unresolved story, the guardian of a truth that would shape her son's future. Jonas rose unsteadily and walked to her, leaning his head against her arm. She placed her hand on his hair, smoothing back the soft curls. He didn't ask questions, though she knew he sensed a shift in her mood, a gravity that had not been there before. Children felt such things instinctively. He pressed closer, and she took strength from the warmth of his small body. "We have to go home," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "But first, we have to carry everything with us." She began packing their belongings. The jars remained on the shelves, the years of confessions left undisturbed. Those were not meant to leave this place. She understood that now. They were Garrett's burden, his attempt at redemption. But the metal box, the photographs, the documents, the letter addressed to her, those were different. Those were the parts of his life that still needed to be reckoned with. She wrapped the box in one of the blankets, cushioning it against the cold, and placed it carefully into her pack. Jonas watched silently, curiosity flickering in his eyes, but tempered by trust. The cabin felt smaller as she prepared to leave, its walls closing around memories she had only just learned to see. The shelves of jars stood in their solemn rows, decades of silence sealed in wax. She touched one jar lightly before she turned away. It was not forgiveness she felt. Not yet, but something adjacent to understanding. Garrett had been flawed, deeply so, but he had loved her with a sincerity she could no longer question. His secrets were not betrayals of their love. They were remnants of a life haunted by decisions made long before she had entered it. Stepping outside, she lifted Jonas into her arms briefly, setting him down gently into the deep snow. It reached nearly to his knees, but he trudged forward gamely, holding her hand as they made their way through the canyon. The air was clear, biting cold, with a sharpness that filled Marla's lungs and cleared her mind. The canyon walls towered above them, streaked with frost, and the wind that moved through the narrow passage brushed against their faces like a hesitant whisper. As they walked, Marla felt the pull of the world beyond the canyon, the life awaiting them at home. But alongside that pull came another, a quiet, persistent call from the letter in the metal box, the call to find Andrea, the granddaughter Garrett had met and lost. Marla knew it would not be easy. She didn't even know where to begin searching. But she also knew that turning away from this truth would be a betrayal, not only of Garrett's final hope, but of Jonas's right to know the full story of the family he came from. By the time they reached the upper plateau, the sun was higher in the sky, though its warmth did little to soften the cold. The landscape stretched before them, a vast sweep of white broken only by the dark silhouettes of distant trees. Marla paused, gazing out across the snowy expanse. It looked endless, untouched, a blank page waiting for whatever story she chose to write upon it. The journey home was slow, each step sinking into the deep snow, each breath crystallizing in the frigid air. Jonas tired quickly, and Marla lifted him onto her hip, carrying him for long stretches despite the strain it placed on her muscles. She kept her eyes fixed on the familiar landmarks, the crooked pine, the ridge of bare rock, the narrow path bending toward the town. The world seemed quieter now, as if respecting the burden she carried. Hours passed before they reached the outskirts of Fox Hollow. The roofs of houses peeked through the snow, smoke curling from chimneys in thin plumes that wavered in the cold air. Jonas stirred, lifting his head to look at the familiar streets, and a small smile crossed his face. For him, home was simple: warm rooms, familiar smells, his toys and books waiting where he left them. For Marla, home was something more complicated now, a place to rebuild, to re-examine, to rediscover what her life would be without the illusions she once held. Inside the house, the warmth enveloped them, melting the stiffness in their limbs. Marla set Jonas on the couch, wrapped him in blankets, and then carried the metal box to the kitchen table. It looked out of place there, too heavy with meaning, too full of the past. But she knew that she could not hide it away. It had to remain where she could face it, where she could return to it as she made decisions about the future. The days that followed were quiet. Marla moved through them in a careful rhythm, tending to Jonas, cleaning the house, preparing meals, and returning again and again to the metal box. She laid out the documents on the table, studied the photographs, reread the letter. Each time she read Garrett's words, she felt the truth settle deeper into her bones. She began searching online for Andrea's name, for any record of her in Washington State. But the trail was faint. There were many women named Andrea, with no clear link to Garrett's past. The search felt daunting, nearly impossible, yet she persisted. Every night after Jonas went to sleep, she returned to the table, driven by a sense of responsibility she could not ignore. One evening, as snow fell gently outside the window, she found something an article from a small local paper, dated 3 years earlier. A young woman named Andrea Hamilton had spoken at a community memorial event, honoring her father, who had died in a construction accident. The article mentioned that she had been trying to learn more about her family's roots, that she had been seeking information about a grandfather she had never met. Marla felt her breath catch. The details fit the timeline. The location fit Garrett's account, and the photograph in the article, a young woman with dark hair and gentle eyes, made something inside Marla tighten. There was a resemblance, faint but unmistakable, to Garrett's younger face. She printed the article, her fingers trembling slightly, as she placed it beside the metal box. The next step was clear now. She would write to Andrea. She would reach out, not as a stranger, but as someone who understood how loss could shape a life. She would offer the truth Garrett had been unable to give. She would give Andrea the chance to choose whether to accept it. The letter took days to write. Marla rewrote it several times, struggling to find the right balance between honesty and sensitivity. She told Andrea who she was, who Garrett had been in her life, and that she had found something in the mountains that belonged to both of them. She wrote of Jonas, of the family they now shared without ever having met. She wrote of Garrett's final wishes, of the hope he had carried that the next generation might find connection where he had failed. When she finally sealed the envelope, she felt a sense of clarity settle over her. Not closure, because grief did not end so neatly, but direction. She walked to the post office with the letter in her coat pocket, Jonas holding her hand. The winter wind brushed against her cheeks, crisp and cold. At the counter, she held the letter for a moment longer, then placed it gently onto the scale. The postal worker weighed it, stamped it, and sent it on its way. Walking back home, Marla felt something shift inside her. She had taken the first step toward bridging the fractured past Garrett had left behind. The rest would unfold slowly, in time, as all meaningful things did. But she no longer felt alone in the weight of what she carried. She felt the strength of her own resolve, the love she held for her son, and the quiet hope that somewhere in Washington state, a young woman might one day read her letter and choose to write back. That night, as she tucked Jonas into bed, he looked up at her with sleepy eyes. "Mom," he asked softly, "are we different now?" She brushed a curl from his forehead and kissed him gently. "No," she said. "We're just more than we were before." He smiled, satisfied with that answer, and drifted into sleep. Marla stood by his bedside for a long time, watching the steady rise and fall of his breath, feeling the warmth of the home around her. Outside, the snow fell quietly, softening the world, laying a fresh layer over everything that had come before. And for the first time since she opened the Bible in the attic and found the map, she felt something like peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace that comes from knowing the truth, accepting its weight, and stepping forward into whatever future it made possible. If you want more stories, subscribe, watch the next videos, and share this one.